Hello everyone, my name's Robin, I'm from Birmingham LGBT. If you're not familiar with that acronym, that stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender. And for today, I'm just going to be looking at that T. We're going to be talking about some of the very basics of transgender awareness. And I'm going to be rushing through because there's quite a lot to cover, even though it's just the basics. I'm going to start by looking with some terminology. I found that this is often something that a lot of people are a bit unfamiliar with. They're very unsure. They're really worried about saying the wrong thing. So this is to give you a bit of an idea about sort of some of the basic terminology so that you don't get off on the wrong foot with a trans person, essentially. We're going to start by looking at sex, which I'm sure you're all probably more familiar with. This is our little diagram. It's called the genderbread person. It's used in lots of presentations like this one to illustrate some of the differences between various concepts. So looking here in the sort of genital region of our genderbread person, we have sex, which is typically male or female and encompasses reproductive organs, hormones, and chromosomes. So at birth, infants are assigned a sex based on their external sex organs. So perhaps someone observes a penis when the baby is born and will announce it's a boy. So that would be a baby who is assigned male at birth. Or someone will observe a vagina when a baby is born and announce it's a girl, which would be assigned female at birth. Most people use this term interchangeably with gender, but I'll explain in a second why perhaps that isn't the most useful thing. So in contrast to sex, here represented by a little rainbow brain, we have gender identity, which is a person's internal, deeply held sense of someone's gender. As I said, most people use this interchangeably with sex, but I find the difference between these two concepts becomes a lot more apparent where for a particular individual, their sex assigned at birth does not align with their gender identity. I'll talk about that a little bit in a second. For the purposes of today and also just in general, I would use the terms male and female to refer to sex and the terms man and woman to refer to gender. In addition to these, we have gender expression, which you can sort of see here outlined as the sort of external parts of our genderbread person. And this is the way that someone outwardly expresses themselves. And you can think of this in terms of masculinity and femininity. This could be through behavior, mannerisms, interests, or most often through clothing. This might not necessarily correspond to someone's gender in the way you might expect. Say, for instance, there are some men who present in a very feminine manner, and this makes them no less men. And indeed, there are some women who choose to present very masculine. So you can think of gender expression in terms of masculinity and femininity, as opposed to gender identity, which is more man and woman. Finally, here represented by our little heart, we have sexual orientation, which is a person's physical and or romantic attraction to another person. The difference between someone's sexual orientation and their gender identity is that your sexual orientation is who you love, and your gender identity is actually who you are. Now, earlier I mentioned that there might be some people for whom their gender identity does not correspond to the sex they were assigned at birth. And these people will be transgender, or trans for short. So this is an umbrella term for anyone whose gender identity does not align with the sex they were assigned at birth. This umbrella term can encompass a number of different identities and a range of different people with different life experiences, some of which I'll cover now. Starting with trans women or transgender women. A good example of that would be myself. I am a transgender woman myself. So this would be someone who was assigned male at birth, so someone announced it's a boy, but who now identifies as a woman. Probably the most famous examples of trans women that you may have heard of would be actress Laverne Cox or former Olympian Caitlyn Jenner. We also have trans men, which is someone who was assigned female at birth. So someone announced it's a girl, but who now identifies as a man. The most famous example of a trans man is probably Chaz Bono, who is the singer Cher's son. In addition to these, though, we also have non-binary people. Binary here refers to the binary of man or woman. So to be non-binary is to exist outside of these categories. This could be someone, as represented here, who sort of sits in the middle of the spectrum between man and woman. It might be someone who moves along the spectrum over a period of time. Or it might be someone who does not identify with gender at all. And probably the most famous examples of non-binary people could be the singers Demi Lovato or Sam Smith, for example. I know that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of definitions. I'm going to send you a resource pack that I use from a much longer training session that I do. So if you want to have a peruse, there's a lot more detail in there around a range of different topics, but it also has all of that terminology and a little bit more. But as we're pressed for time today, I'll keep it brief. And then the second thing we're going to be looking at is to do with inclusive practice. These are basically things that you can do as an organization, as a worker, to better include your trans service users and colleagues. So not all trans people are able to change their name legally. This could be, say, for instance, if someone is not out to their family, and by out, I mean their family do not know they are transgender yet. So they may have not been able to legally change their name. And when this is the case, you should call someone by whatever name they ask you to, even if this isn't their legal name. However, if they have legally changed their name should be changed on all of your company records and systems, and the old name expunged entirely. Evidence for changing the name could include something like a deed poll or other evidence such as an updated birth certificate or passport. In terms of changing gender marker on a computer system or on a record, best practice can be seen in the NHS, who do so upon request without requiring any evidence. You shouldn't be challenging the person making the request based on their current appearance or presentation. Neither should you be inquiring about surgery or any other medical interventions. These should never be made requirements for changing gender marker. To then comply with data protection regulations, the old name should be expunged and entirely replaced by the new name on all systems and records. This is particularly important as sort of having relics of their old name somewhere on the system could potentially out them as transgender to someone who comes across their record without that person's consent, which may constitute a GDPR breach. Would likely constitute a GDPR breach, in fact. In terms of pronouns, these are what we use to refer to one another. Most people use he or she, his or hers. And when you know the gender of a trans person, you should use the pronoun that matches a trans person's affirmed gender. So for a transgender woman, such as myself, my affirmed gender would be woman. So if you know someone is a transgender woman, you should be referring to her using she, her, and hers. If you know someone is a transgender man, you should be referring to him with he, him, and his. You should, however, never be assuming someone's gender and use gender-neutral language when someone's gender is unknown. So using they and them when you don't know someone's gender is always the safest option. If you have the opportunity to do so privately, you can always ask someone, what pronouns do you use? Just please make sure you do this privately. As a quick note, I know that some companies sort of do a bit of a pronoun go around at the start of meetings, so everyone might volunteer their pronouns. And this is very good, this is fine. But what you shouldn't be doing is publicly singling out one person and asking their pronouns in front of other people because you suspect they might be trans, because that kind of puts a lot of attention on them and could cause some potential embarrassment. So unless you're making everyone, unless you're asking everyone, make sure to ask an individual privately. You may hear the term preferred pronouns, but I actually don't like this phrase as it sort of suggests that using someone's pronouns is an option. You should never treat using the correct pronouns for someone as optional. It's actually a matter of basic respect. And if you don't respect this, you're likely going to receive quite a negative response. Actually, deliberately not using someone's chosen name and pronouns when you use the correct terms for everyone else is actually an example of direct discrimination under the Equalities Act 2010. That said, obviously, making a mistake isn't discrimination, but deliberately using the wrong pronouns and names would be. In terms of non-binary people, it's increasingly common to use they and them in the singular as their pronoun. And in regards to titles, you might see MX, which can be pronounced MX, MX, or Mixter as a gender-neutral alternative title. In terms of what to do when you get it wrong, because you absolutely will, and even I do now and again, you should apologize briefly and move on. Please don't make a scene. So apologizing repeatedly or at length can draw further attention to the issue and cause further embarrassment. You should, however, make every effort to not repeat the mistake, as repeatedly making these kinds of mistakes can cause a trans person a great deal of distress even. If you do make a few mistakes for the same person and you want to give a bit more of an in-depth response, just please make sure you do so privately and not in front of other people. In terms of disclosure and outing, so outing is the act of disclosing someone's transgender status without their consent. You would also use outing to refer to disclosing if someone was gay or a lesbian, for example, without their consent. And this can actually put someone at risk of discrimination, harassment, or violence. I would never disclose someone's transgender status without their explicit consent. It's not always apparent that a person is trans based on their appearance, and someone's transgender status is sensitive personal data for data protection purposes, in line with similar to any other information that might be on someone's medical records, for example. This information must be used and accessed lawfully, fairly, only with necessary and with explicit consent. All staff should be aware of their responsibilities around data protection. In terms of single-sex accommodation, if your organisation provides single-sex accommodation to staff or service users, it should have a clear policy on the provision of this accommodation for trans people, and ultimately you've got to follow the policy that your organisation has. These policies can vary significantly between organisations in how trans inclusive they are. Those responsible for creating or updating such a policy must ensure that it's compliant with the Equalities Act 2010. And if those responsible aren't sure about the policy, they should seek out some support and guidance. Talking about best practice, and I've seen this reflected very closely in some NHS trusts, would be to house a trans service user in the same sex accommodation of their affirmed gender as default. So as default, transgender women should be placed in the women's, transgender men in the men's, and you should be giving non-binary people their choice. You can offer to house a trans person in a single or private room, or even in accommodation based on their assigned sex at birth, but only if this is their preference. Say, for instance, there may be a transgender man who is very early in his transition, who may prefer to be in with the women's. He may not have accessed hormones yet. He may not be presenting as a man full-time yet. So you can offer some flexibility, but you shouldn't be forcing people into accommodation of their assigned sex at birth at all, really. You should treat the service user as their affirmed gender, including for use of toilets and training and changing areas, and don't tolerate discrimination from staff or other service users. In terms of phone etiquette, there are going to be some trans people who have voices that are lower or higher pitched than you might expect for someone of that gender. Using myself as an example again, my voice is probably a bit deeper than most women's. However, it would be inappropriate to refer to someone as Sir just because they have a deep voice, despite their records saying their name is Ms. Catherine Sullivan, for example. If you're unsure about someone's gender, referring to them using their name avoids using gendered terms such as Sir or Madam. If you're concerned about data protection and that you're not speaking to the correct person, confirmation of personal details, such as address or date of birth, can be used. In terms of accountability, please just do correct your co-workers and other service users when they make a mistake, and follow up through the official channels if they're actively being discriminatory. So this might be a grievance procedure or a disciplinary procedure if someone is being discriminatory towards any minority group, in this particular example, trans people. And as our final little bit of inclusive practice, we've got a bit of a flashback to the early 2000s with some slide animations. We're talking about genitals and trans-related surgery. So asking about a trans person's body or past surgeries, particularly when pertaining to genitals, is a very sensitive issue and in most contexts should be avoided entirely. I mean, there are some contexts where it would be appropriate, say if you're a sexual health practitioner and you needed to know about someone's genitals to provide appropriate care. In that case, it would be appropriate, but in most instances, it would not